So this is a thought that I've been struggling with for a while. Ever since delves were announced in World of Warcraft, I've been thinking about this. So, in order to understand the content, now Ian used a word when he described delves. He said that this is evergreen content. And the current system isn't evergreen. So, the way to explain this to you, there are effectively three types of content that one can make in a game. The one is what I like to call seasonal. Okay, so dungeons, for example, is a system that exists in World of Warcraft and it always exists. Every single expansion has its dungeons. But dungeons are seasonal content. Why? Because every expansion you have to redevelop 8 new dungeons. The same with raids. There's 2 or 3 raids in every single expansion, sometimes 4, and they have to be redeveloped every single expansion. These are seasonal systems, right? So they require active work every single season in order for them to actually make sense and to actually be playable. Dungeons cannot ever be called an evergreen system, even though dungeons always exist. They're always there, because an old dungeon doesn't matter. No one's going to keep playing the game just for an old dungeon. So it requires active development time. The other type of content that you can make in a game is temporary systems. We all know what those are. We all played through Legion. We played through BFA. We played through Shadowlands. Temporary systems are, generally speaking, really bad, although if you make them really well, they can work. It just, you can't hinge the entire success of your expansion on them, but they can work as long as they don't offer too much power. Temporary systems do have a place. But generally speaking, you want to be very light on temporary systems. And then you have the evergreen system. The thing that separates evergreen from both of the other two is that they usually require a shit ton of development to make, but once they're done, they are done. In other words, you never have to work on them again, or if you do, it's very little maintenance work. You make the system to be perfectly playable and replayable no matter what. So there's no next designs or new designs, no new additions. It is a perfect system in and of itself because it does its own job every single time. Okay? Now, an example of that in gaming would be the deep dungeon system in Final Fantasy XIV, the jumping puzzles in Final Fantasy XIV. Both of these are examples of evergreen systems. You also have the Baja and Eureka zones in Final Fantasy XIV that are examples of evergreen systems. The jumping puzzles in Final Fantasy XIV, once they were designed, you never have to touch them again. A jumping puzzle is a jumping puzzle and people can always go jump, right? The deep dungeons, once they are designed, they exist. There's no new additions. You're not adding new floors. They just exist. And if players feel like they want to take on that challenge, they can take on that challenge. And the thing that changes it up is going into it with different jobs. So every job you take into a deep dungeon will start a new run for you in that deep dungeon. And now you get to experience the deep dungeon from the perspective of a different job or a class, as we know them in World of Warcraft. Delves don't seem to operate on this basis. The way I'm looking at delves and what I'm seeing from people playing delves, they look more like a new seasonal system. Because these delves that currently exist aren't going to be alluring or fun for players in the next expansion. Players aren't going to come back to these delves in the next expansion to do more of them. Because they are limited in what they provide. Right? They're limited. So yeah, you can look at them more like a solo dungeon. Dungeons are fun, but after a while you get sort of tired with the dungeon because it is limited in what it provides. It doesn't have multiple floors and multiple layers to it. It is just the one layer that you'll do a couple of times, maybe even 100 or 200 times, but then eventually you'll get tired of it. This, by definition, means that it is not an evergreen system, and the way that delves will continue is Blizzard will have to design new delves every single expansion. So in that, it is technically an evergreen system because technically delves will now exist in every new expansion, but it's not the same delves that exist in every new expansion, right? It's different delves. It's delves that were actually developed and designed. Developers cost money, so development time being spent on that by definition means it's not an evergreen system. My problem with this is you're again limited to the amount of money or the amount of evergreen systems that you can build before you just run out of developers to make these new evergreen systems. Because the evergreen systems, as Ian pointed it out to be, isn't actually an evergreen system. It's a seasonal system that's just now going to be with the game forever and ever and ever, much like dungeons and raids, but it's still going to require development time. This is not... I really hope that this isn't how Blizzard is going to continuously do it, because it means that in another 6 or 7 years, we're going to get to a point where Blizzard will physically not have enough developers to make all of their evergreen systems, because I want to point out, Ian said in an interview with BlizzCon that every new expansion will now get a new evergreen system being added to it. So you can immediately think, you have delves this expansion, right? The War Within. Next expansion, maybe you get something like a Torghast. That's now an evergreen system, but every expansion they're going to add new floors to it. Then the expansion after that, you get something like the Mist of Pandaria farm that they're going to keep adding on to, right? And then the expansion after that, you get something like a reworked zone or some shit that they're going to add on to. In 4 expansions, there's no more developers to make anything. Like, there is no more evergreen systems that can be developed into World of Warcraft because, well, they're all working on the current evergreen systems. And while that's great, because it just means a shit ton of new content for players to play, it's not a long-term sustainable solution where an actual evergreen system, like, for example, a Torghast that is made one and done, you give Torghast 250 floors, you make it replayable multiple times, and you make it really challenging so the players will take months to actually complete Torghast. That is an evergreen system. Once you're done, you're done. You never add new floors. You never go in to rebalance or redo anything. The only time you will rebalance is when you're introducing a new spec into the game or a new class into the game, or if you're reworking classes to make sure that those classes can still do Torghast. But fundamentally, this is now, it's done and done, right? This is it. This is the end of it. You don't have to worry about it anymore. I really hope that that is the plan, and that Delves is really just a new type of outdoor content, outdoor for casual players, rather than this being Blizzard's idea of what an evergreen system would be. I hope that kind of makes sense to people. Like, what my fear is for Delves, because the last thing I want is for us to run into another nightmare scenario where, you know, every expansion is just this amalgamation of new systems, you know, coming down the pipeline. So rather than just having one system per expansion, now you have 4 or 5 new systems per expansion, and it's just a bit of a nightmare, you know? Housing is a great example of a hybrid system. So it's sort of seasonal, but it's also very much evergreen, because the base stuff that you do for a house will always be relevant no matter what, and it doesn't require much of any development once it's done. The only development that then becomes a thing with housing is adding new things per expansion, right? So new wall types or wall patterns, new roof patterns and types, new doodads and shit that you can put down, right? But considering that most of the things that you're going to add are usually things that already you made for the expansion and for the zone, you're not really doing any work. You're just taking the work that's already there and giving it to housing players so that they can build their houses. So very little development in that regard. So yes, housing would be another example of what we would call an evergreen system, although it is a little bit hybrid, insofar as there is still some work that needs to be done, but not nearly as much as like the Delve system.